Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Consent and Safety in Horror Gaming panel. I am Ian E. Muller from Gehenna Gaming. Most of you have seen my face far too much over the last day, 24 hours, so I'm going to cut my intro very short. But today we're going to be talking about consent and why it's very important in horror tabletop gaming in particular, but tabletop gaming in general, as well as different safety mechanics you can use in your games to ensure your players feel safe and comfortable, regardless of what topics you are exploring in your games. I'm going to go through and introduce all the panelists here, and then we'll dive right into it. So, Jax, I'll start with you.
Hello. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Bryk, aka Jax, she, her. I am an award-winning LARP and tabletop designer, and if you are familiar with safety rules in gaming recently, you will have seen my techniques listed in Changeling the Lost 2nd Edition and Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition.
Also, apologies, my pronouns are he, him, or gibbering horde, I often tell people. I answer to that as well. Sorry. My phone just decided to close. All right, Crystal.
Hi, I'm Crystal Mazur, she, her mix. And I wrote on Chicago by Night, Let the Streets Run Red, Snowhaven, and Never Going Home and Pip System. And I'm the lead developer for the Pip System for Third Eye Games. And I write in safety mechanics for certain scenarios and stuff like that I've written, especially for like Never Going Home. And I am a very big advocate for using safety mechanics at the tabletop and in LARP. And so yeah.
Thank you. Natalie?
Hi, I'm Natalie Pudim. I'm a professional game master for Charm Person Games out of Baltimore, Maryland. Pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. Cassie?
Hi, I'm Cassie Clark, she, her. I am the writer, producer, and keeper for The Lovely Craftians, which is a Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast here in Chicago.
Cool. And Conri?
Hi, I'm Conri. I am the co-founder and editor-in-chief at Devil's Luck Gaming. I run many Chronicles of Darkness games, as well as I took part in the V5 launch with White Wolf, and I write for companies like Onyx Path.
Wonderful. So I just want to kick this off by really talking about the role that consent and safety mechanics play in gaming at large, in case anyone is unfamiliar with what that means. And I just want to hand it over to all of you. Really, yeah, absolutely, Jax. What is consent?
Wow, that's a question. I have two rules for when I am designing a game or writing on a game, which is talk to your players and immersion is a false god. Essentially what that means is talk to your players is something that we all say, but it's not, I think, something that people until recently have really started developing a common language for, because there's this idea that as a GM, you have to surprise your players. You have to spring things on them. You have to make them scramble to react. And I don't think that's necessarily fair to what being a good GM actually means. So being able, and we're going to talk about session 0 later, but being able to have a session 0, being able to say, what do you want from this experience and how can I help? And the second one is immersion as a false god, which basically means immersion is fun and good and important, but at the end of the day, if somebody's getting hurt because other people are so immersed in the game that they are ignoring the fact that players are more important than the game, then immersion is less important than your players. Immersion is less important than you as a GM, because a GM is just another type of player, which I think is something we also all forget.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to add on that?
Sure, I'll add on that. Another way I like to treat safety tools is my mantra that I introduced to a lot of my players is to treat safety tools less like safe words and to treat them more like a tool for collaborative editing. If role-playing games are like a way to collaboratively write and tell a story together, we should be able to edit that story together too. So rather, you can safety tool because something is, personally traumatizing to you, but you can also safety tool, or safety tool because the story isn't going in a way that you really feel comfortable with. Like, if your character got left out of a scene, I use the cut safety tool as a very favorite of mine. Being able to say cut and like, is there a way we can bring my player in the scene? I'm feeling left out. And
I like that.
yeah, so just being able to kind of lower the stakes of them a little bit. I think a lot of the talk in the role-playing game community lately has been about kind of raising the stakes of safety tools and just being able to make them easy and something everyone feels comfortable using, even when it's not, personally terrible for someone.
Crystal, Cassie?
Yeah, so I do believe safety mechanics are very, very important, and it should be collaborative, but there comes a point where a player should have the agency to be able to say, nope, I want out of this completely. This is not for me.
Absolutely.
And so it gives a very, very good hard stop. And I think when you put safety mechanics in at your table, you are saying to your players that they matter for the story, rather than, nope, I don't want safety mechanics at all. This is my story, and you are just actors in it.
Yes.
And that's not what role-playing games are.
But if you don't mind, I want to follow up with a question there. And this is something
Yeah.
we've experienced, Gehenna Gaming specifically has experienced in convention play, which is players saying they don't want to use safety mechanics.
Yeah, go ahead. Ask the question.
So the question is like, how do you handle that as opposed to the GM being the one saying they're not interested?
I also have a response to this once Crystal's done.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean that's something that if a player doesn't want safety mechanics, that's on them, and then that's their choice to walk away from the table at that point. Like as a player, if I were to go to a horror game, table, and the GM was like, nope, we're not using safety mechanics, I would walk away.
Yep.
So if as a GM, I'm like, okay, I want safety mechanics in place so that I know where I can push things and where I can't. If there's a player at the table that doesn't want them, that might not be the game for them, because and then at that point it's the player's choice to walk away. There is also the player's choice of, nope, I'm okay with whatever happens, in which case, I mean, then you as a GM can also say, well, I'm using safety mechanics, you don't want to use them, I don't feel comfortable right now because I don't know where I can push it and I don't want to go too far with you.
Yep.
So it's kind of at that point then the GM and the player have to have a conversation about that and come to some sort of hopefully mutual agreement on what's going to happen at the table or not.
So something I want to follow up with on that is after Fate of Cthulhu came out with safety tools and denouncing Lovecraft, it's a racist writer, but a founding influence in the sort of realm of cosmic horror. I wrote an entire thread about this on Twitter, and something that I discovered from talking to usually older cis men who don't want to use safety rules, because that's my experience. That's just anecdotal. That might not be the case.
We don't need to not all men. It's okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I think we're
okay. Just making sure. But something I realized is when you say to one of those dudes, "Hey, I am going to use safety tools," what they hear is two very important geek social fallacies, which are ostracizers are evil and friends accept me as I am. If you're not familiar with the geek social fallacies, just Google geek social fallacies. It's a good read. It's actually a really good self-assessment tool for a lot of us because I still struggle with geek social fallacies. Um, and something that I realized is this idea that if you're introducing safety tools and this ability for people to say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, it comes off to these people as a personal attack, which is not, hey, I'm not comfortable with this thing you're doing. It's, you're a bad person and I'm gonna stop you and I'm condemning you personally. And that was wild to me to experience because there's this almost trauma response in a section of nerd community to people telling them no. And that's where we get a lot of the toxic behaviors, I think, around safety mechanics. And like whenever a safety text gets published, this idea that, you know, oh, they're going to take away my games because they're not really my friends. And that's something I think is really interesting that comes with both Natalie and Crystal's point is a sort of lowering the stakes of using a safety mechanic because it's not telling you no, it's editing play, and that sort of eases people into it. But it's also like using a safe word in a BDSM dungeon in that it should have that same weight. It should have that same respect that comes with it, right?
Absolutely.
Yep. So just to throw that in with Jack's a little bit a tag onto that. I worked at a haunted house for 17 years, and one of the things that most people don't ever realize is that almost every single room that you go into has at least 2 exits, none of which you'll ever see. And they also have a safety mechanic built into 99% of the houses where if you say, I am done, or you put your hands on your head or whatever the case may be, they escort you out and none of the scares can touch you, scare you, or anything like that. They are all trained to respect that. So you go to a haunted house knowing you're going to get scared and you still have a way out. So there's no reason why you can't have a way out at the game table.
But
Conri, go ahead. Mute.
Yep. Whoops.
I forgot which button my push to talk was, so I just jammed on a thing and hoped for the best.
I appreciate the conference call etiquette.
The idea of somebody saying no to safety mechanics, it's usually my best policy that I found is that it's to remind them that it is a tool there to be used. They're informed of them. They know how they work, and they might not have to pick them up throughout the game, but the bare minimum, they have to accept and respect them. And if they are at the impasse of I don't want to play in this game if these mechanics are even present, then that's where the impasse is. Well, I guess one of us isn't going to be at the table.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it's a situation where it's like, I'm not going to use safety tools. Well, here's what they are. Here's what they mean. And you're allowed to still, we can still go forward so long as you respect them if somebody else uses them. And they're on the table. If you ever change your mind, here they are, use them.
Just anecdotally, like I am someone who is nothing really bothers me in a game setting. So I am that person where it's like, I personally do not typically need a safety mechanic because I doubt a GM is going to bother me with anything that they present in the game, but I will 100% respect if other people use them and I want them available. They're very important for that purpose. Cassie, I wanted to circle back around to you before we move down to the next topic. What is consent and what are safety mechanics to you, and how are you using them?
So to me, a safe player has fun, and if they're not feeling safe, they're not going to have fun, and that defeats the entire point. Like, it is horror, but it's also a game, and you're trying to tell a story together, and if somebody isn't feeling like they're safe, they're not going to really give their all into that. And it's important to me to have the safety tools. So if somebody said, I'm not using them and I don't think anyone should, which I have had friends who said that, I was like, well, I guess I'm not at your table then. It's just a matter of keeping me safe. It's a matter of keeping your keeper, your GM, or your DM safe as well, because Like there's nothing worse than playing with friends and accidentally detonating a trauma bomb. It's the worst thing. So
Yeah.
if you can avoid that at all costs, 100% do it. There's no excuse not to.
I think before we move on to talk about different types of safety mechanics and how they can be used, it's important to remember that really this is about respect. It's not about limiting someone or changing how a game is played. It's about just respecting the other people.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of different safety mechanics. I know we've all used one or combinations of all of them. Dax, I know you've worked them into many of the games that you've created or run. Crystal, you and I have talked about them at length. Natalie, I played in a game with you very recently where we discussed it. So I want to start this with Conri or Cassie talking about some of the different safety mechanics you actively use in your games.
I cede the floor.
I was about to do the same. So I have a couple of different safety tools that we use, and one of them is a session zero of a sort. It's kind of an ongoing session zero where we do a sort of mental health form check-in before every session where they don't have to tell me specifics, but if they're not feeling great this week or their anxiety is really high or they're struggling somehow, I know that ahead of time and we can either reschedule or we can do something a little bit more lighthearted that isn't as that isn't going to be triggering all that much to them. Um, it's just a good way for me to gauge what the story should be on a given week and if everyone's okay playing. We do that for guests as well. I make them fill out like a please tell me, you don't have to give me specifics, but tell me what your absolutely no's are. Chances that they're going to be in the game anyway are pretty slim, but I don't even want to go close if somebody's upset by something. And then in game, we have kind of a mix of remote players and at table players. So the at table players get a yellow card, red card system. So they can just hold it up without saying anything. And I might ask what part of it was doing it to avoid that, but we just stop immediately from there. And then for the remote people, we kind of use a modified X system where they can just drop an X in chat, and that's that.
Conri?
Probably overkill, but
Someone just asked like how many tools are too many for a one shot. So that's a good. We can circle back around to that in a bit.
For me and my tables, I tend to use a combination when I have prep time and a session zero. I go fully into I believe they've been called lines and veils. In some systems, I call them hard and soft limits because I come from a kink mindset at sometimes in that regard, and that's how they best translate it to me. But during play, I tend to use the X card, heavily modified. So there's like a, and it's also modified off the OK check-in from LARPs, which the OK check-in in LARPs is you basically give like the OK symbol discreetly, and then you either get a thumbs up, which is yeah, fuck me up, fam, we're good. You get a strict thumbs down, which is no go, do not, I'm out. And then there's either you get either a
Hand
shaky
waggle.
hand or a sideways thumb, and that's I'm not sure, which should be treated immediately as no, we're not going forward. And the way I usually treat those is that it's immediately cut right there. The scene ends. We do a little bit of bookkeeping for like, well, how did that scene just quickly resolve to tie up any immediate concerns. And then after the session, I do a check-in with the players and see like, okay, where's the spots that we can adjust, bring it around so that this doesn't need to be used again for this particular thing, or we can reduce the likelihood that we cut scenes, and it's more about keeping a flow and keeping everyone safe and trying to keep those two things in balance. At least that's what my focus is.
Natalie?
So the safety tools I use, which I actually learned from Brian Liberge, who runs games for the PAX Games on Demand, is cut and fade to black are kind of my favorite. Just going back to the editing language, like cut stops the play, and we can talk about it and discuss, and it can be like, hey, this person summoned a bunch of spiders. I can't stand spiders. Like, can we make them something else? And like, yep, they're mice. Does mice work? And they're like, yep. And then, hey, the spiders are mice. And but also another way I like to let people use cut is like if there's a character who's like, let's say, being abusive, and that's difficult for people, like players can say, hey, I'm okay with this, but I need things to end badly for this character. This character can't get away with it at the end of the session. And I'll be like, yeah, sure. Like they will get their due by the end of this session and things like that. And then the other tool is fade to black, where if the big place it ends up happening is sex scenes. I play a lot of Monster Hearts, but the other play, like anyone can fade to black basically anytime, and I let people use it as a tool if they don't want to talk about it. Like if they don't want to delve into their trauma and the scene is too much, they could just be like fade to black, and we won't talk about it. And I'm not going to make there have been a big twist in the story while the camera wasn't on it. Like that's when the vampire slayers found the stake and no one knows they have it, or something like that. Like the fade to black, we're all gonna maybe have an idea of what happened in that scene, but none of us are gonna talk about it. Not lean over to the other player and be like, hey, what do you think happened? And I find that those tools, again, like because using film editing language over like a safe word language makes them a little less scary to use, I think, for some people. It lets them use them at a lower threshold of discomfort, I think. They could say cut and be like, hey, I don't know if I'm okay with this. Can we talk about it real quick, like where you're planning to go with it? Or something like that, rather than using an X card, which kind of feels sometimes like I'm ruining the fun for everyone. I've had players react that way.
Interesting. Jax, yeah.
So going off of Natalie's discussion, a tool I haven't used a lot, but I think is really interesting, is the sort of safety VCR, which is you can pause to talk about something, you can rewind, or you can fast forward. And it sort of combines this cut and fade to black. And I love fade to black too, as well. I think that's a great tool. My group calls it blue dot because we've had people in radio broadcasting, or blue screen, but that's another fun one. I also really like, just from both a Portland group and the King scene, the red, yellow, green check-in, and being able to sort of have a stoplight on your table. So like if you want more of something, you can touch green. If you want to slow down or sort of hold at the level you're at yellow. And if you need something to stop or you need to take stock of something, just hit red. In one shots, because I wanted to sort of address that question, I tend to use the X card and lines and veils in one shots, especially in Bluebeard's Bride, because I think it's more important to really get a sense of what people are not willing to go for in a game like Bluebeard's Bride or Quietus or 10 Candles, where it is a very visceral game. It is for those of you who don't know, Bluebeard's Bride does include sexual horror as part of the concept of the game. And it works really well because the game was written by trauma survivors and rape survivors. And having that gravity around the act and treating that act with, I guess, respect is the word I'm looking for, but treating it as something horrible instead of something wacky or something crazy that happened in a stream like Far Verona, which we heard about this week, because I wanted to bring that up during this panel. Really, it's that idea of treating things with gravity and respect at your table and being able to understand what certain acts mean for certain people, I think, in a lot of ways. You're giving me an eyebrow, Natalie. I can't tell what that is.
No, I'm not giving you an eyebrow. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I was thinking yesterday I was in the humor and horror panel, and we kind of discussion about trying to both be funny and light to light intention, and
Yeah.
where that can go wrong. And I was thinking about that.
You were awesome in that panel, by the way. The final safety mechanic I wanted to get around to, and this I think does address another question in the chat, is sometimes you just need to be able to tell your players to say no and to say yes. And that's really hard for us being in a society, just in general, because we live in a society, certainly. And some of us, especially those of us who were raised assigned female at birth, are always taught that we can't say no, but we're also taught that we can't say yes to things that we want to engage with because one is greedy and the other is prudish. So just constantly reminding your players you're allowed to say no to things and you're also allowed to say yes to things. No one's going to judge you. And having that environment of people not judging you unless you're harming other people is really important.
Crystal?
So with my home game, I run a weekly D&D game, and we've used Fade to Black before. We've used yes and no. We are all friends, so a lot of the other things like X card and stuff like that, they are aware of. We've talked about them. I check in with them frequently. So our use of that type of stuff is in our weekly game is a little bit more relaxed when it comes to that type of thing. But when I run stuff at conventions, I always use the X card or the OK check-in system, depending on if I have a card available for the X card. Because I think it's a good visual too, where if you have an X card on the table, someone can just touch it and the storyteller knows, okay, we're stopping here. We just move on to the next scene. No big deal. And I do like the OK check-in system because it's a very good visual for knowing like what is yes and no, especially in like LARP settings. So those are what I heavily use as far as gaming with people that I am not very familiar with.
Jax?
First of all, if you are doing the VHC drinking game, drink because there's a cat on screen. I want to address the chat real quickly. You caught me off my meds, so I'm about to spit some truth bombs. Please do not, while we are talking about safety, do not rip on other people in chat. That's really shitty. Do not call people on Twitter who don't want to have sexual assault in gaming prudes. Stop it.
That's a good point. Thank you. Threw me off slightly, but no,
I'm sorry.
Was a very good point.
It's not cool.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
There is currently a conversation thread in chat where somebody has tried to ask us the same question 3 times and has been very aggressive about it and is now talking about prudes on Twitter who don't want hard topics in games. Mm-hmm. It is totally valid to not want certain topics in games, and calling people names for that is something we are trying to avoid right now. Yeah. So please stop being a bad example.
That is the point of this conversation. You are correct. And I think to actually piggyback off that, the two things that I wanted to add to this are a consent form, which Gehenna Gaming uses. We were inspired by the Monty Cook consent form, and we customized one we use for all of our one-shot games. If anyone has played a game with us this weekend, you've seen it because we made you fill it out. And that's it. We make people fill it out. If you don't want to fill it out, you lose your spot at the table. It covers literally any topic that could possibly come up in a horror game. We specify that some of those things, like anything of a sexual nature, even romance, probably almost definitely will not come up. But in order for us to understand how to make you feel safe at the table and understand what topics are hard lines, we need to have some awareness. And then we use that to, the GM goes over those before the game starts. If they have to, they can pull the player aside for clarification. We have had people mark blood as a red in a vampire game, and we're like, can you just elaborate slightly on how you feel about that, just so that we know? And they're like, well, I don't want to see like buckets of blood and blah blah. And I'm like, okay, but it's like if a vampire feeds, it's okay. And they're like, yes. And I'm like, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I had something similar in a Bluebeard's Bride game where somebody was like, I don't want violence against children or animals. And I'm like, this is a game that covers motherhood and bodies and ritual hunts. So can we maybe change that to be like graphic violence? Because I'm never going to show graphic torture on
Exactly.
screen.
And every time, from my experience, it's always been they don't want graphic depictions. And it's like, great, thank you for explaining. We will make sure. I've run games that specifically dealt with primal fears and claustrophobia and things like that, and then immediately had a player sit down and redline claustrophobia, and I was like, okay,
Yeah.
I know exactly how to handle that. The other one, for you can't really do it for convention games and one shots. Well, you can do it for one shots if they're not planned, but session zeros. And Cassie, you spoke about this, using an ongoing session zero, which is a fantastic idea. I haven't thought of just doing like a check-in pre-game. But I always use this after learning they existed. I have always used a session zero before any ongoing chronicle to establish, here's what the tone of the game is going to be. Are you all comfortable with that? What are your expectations? What do you want to see in the game? And then we'll go from there. Conri?
And there is this, I'm noticing that everybody's pretty much saying that like it's impossible to do a session zero at a table at a con or something like that, or a one shot like that, where it's just people coming together to quick play a game. Uh, if you look at it as session zero as dedicating a whole game session, sit downs worth of time, dedicating to going over each and every little thing that we are going to do and that's a good thing. I have a required session zero for any game I run on the channel and in life, just in general. I'm a session zero advocate above all. To the point where I even say that even at a con game, the 10 minutes before you actually start playing, where everybody gets to know each other, I consider that's a session zero.
Right.
Here's your lines and veil. Everybody give me your absolute no-go areas. Hey, these are the tools we're using today.
Yep.
This is going to be the themes that I plan on running, because I'm the perpetual chronic storyteller / GM. So I'm usually from behind the screen on that. And I do give a primer on what I plan on using this game for. So if things are like, hey, we're like you mentioned before, we're playing vampire. I don't do blood. Elaborate, or maybe vampire isn't your game. I've canceled games actually and switched to an entirely different game
Absolutely.
because of some of the lines and veils that I've touched on with my players. To use an anecdotal example, I had a friend of mine who was transitioning at the time, and I had really wanted to play Promethean, and the themes in that game really didn't jive with where she was in her transition. And I said, absolutely cool, we're playing Sin Eater now, let's go. And we
Hell
swapped
yeah.
to another game. So it's a matter of, if you're talking about a situation where somebody can be like, all right, I'm sitting out this one, that's great. If you don't want someone to be left out, adjust your game.
Absolutely. What Jack said about making sure people aren't understand they can say yes and no. That's a thing. Like someone you can say no to this game. I will either change the game or I will pick you up for the next one.
Sorry, I kind of jumped topic there in the middle of my point, but I looked at the next topic.
You also answered a chat question at the same time, so it was perfect. Cassie, you were going to say something?
Yeah, so kind of just to piggyback off of that, I use my ongoing session zeros to alert them if I want to push a certain way in the game. So this character is going to yell, "Are you guys okay with that? I want this situation to happen." So not to break immersion completely, but I want them to be aware if there's going to be something that goes above and beyond what our normal baseline usually is. So it gives them a chance to ask me questions about it ahead of time. It gives them a chance to opt out of it if they're just not in the space for it at that moment. So it isn't, I like surprising, but I don't like springing really major surprises on them if they're not prepared for it as players.
I really like that you have an ongoing session, Zero. I think that's rad as hell.
Yeah, I love that concept. I'm definitely stealing that.
It's all yours. Go for it.
I don't think I ever officially had it as a thing, but it's something that I've been doing. But having it a floating session zero concept and solidifying it sounds awesome to me.
So we've kind of run through most of our topics here, and we've been answering questions from chat as we go. One thing I think that people struggle with is actually introducing the safety mechanics at the table. How do they explain them, and how do they make the players understand how to use them properly? We've had a lot of people, we have to explain the consent form every time, because we use a red light, yellow light, green light system on the consent form. We have to explain what each of those means in context, and we have to explain like some of these topics won't be used, etc. So what is your way of introducing those topics so that players understand how they work and are comfortable using? Jax, go ahead.
So I've been running basically ever since the pandemic started, I've been running a game of Bluebeard's Bride every Friday night with people that either like I'm friends with or that I've been acquaintances with but haven't really gamed with. Basically just opening up to my Discord server and taking the first 5 people who come in. And something I do is I always start every session before we even get into character creation or reading the story or whatever, that we're going to talk about things that you don't want in the game. And I always start with, I, as the GM, do not want tryptophobic content in this game. And I don't like, tryptophobia is the fear of tiny holes. I don't like it. It makes my skin itchy. It makes me feel really gross. So I always start my safety mechanics with, here's how I'm using them. Now, why don't you show me how you're going to use them? And then usually I get a lot of, oh, I want this, but I don't want this. And I think that's awesome.
Nice. Crystal.
So one of the coolest ways that I've seen safety mechanics be introduced at the table is actually from Eddie Webb, who in his brief overview just adds the X card right on the table and says, touch this if you don't want me to continue, and moves on. And he explains this is an X card, this is a stop card, and just kind of ties it in with everything that he is running. And I've started doing that at conventions because everyone processes it, sees it, and then they move on. There is no real oh, well, no, I don't want to use that or anything like that. It's the, no, this is part of what's happening. At that point, if somebody walks away, and I have never seen anyone walk away from Eddie's game from it, but if they want to walk away, they have that choice at that point.
Absolutely. Natalie?
I have kind of my regular spiel. I kind of gave you my
you can. Yeah, I was gonna say that it sounded
I have
familiar.
it pretty rehearsed. I run one thing I do is I run a weekly episodic game of D&D for women and non-binary people in my local community.
That's wonderful.
So we have new players dropping in all the time. So I have a weird mix of players who are very comfortable with my safety tools and players who are hearing about safety tools for the first time, or maybe hearing about D&D for the first time. So I kind of have to treat every session as a session zero in some ways. We do kind of an hour before play is when we do our session zero for new players coming in, but all the players aren't there for it. It's challenging, but I've gotten my spiel rehearsed so that players feel comfortable using it, and also kind of One thing I usually try and do every few sessions or something, I will use cut to just make some small edit to something, just so players see that I'm using it and I'm comfortable using it, and it's something that they can feel good using too.
I love that.
Fantastic. Cassie?
So it's kind of collaborative. Like we've been through several iterations of just trying things out to see what sticks and what works best for the table. If I'm playing with people that are just guests or we're at a one shot, I try and communicate everything up front and please use your safety tools. Please use them. Please use them. For the love of God, use them. They're for you. They're for me. They're for everyone. I can't force people to use it, but what I do try and emphasize is that we're playing a horror game and it's not just a fun fantasy adventure. Like even the content alone is predicated on fear and tension, and your character may not survive. So that's something that people really need to keep in mind when they're playing horror games. This is designed to be damaging somehow, and I want to scar the characters. I don't want to scar the players.
Yep.
So finding a tool that works is important. Any tool.
Yeah.
Literally anything.
Jax?
Something I do want to point out here, because again, I'm sure people are thinking about it with the whole incident with Far Verona that happened this past week.
I was wondering if you were going to talk about that.
Should I not? I can.
No, I think we absolutely should. I was going to close with it if it didn't come up naturally. So
Hooray! I helped. But sometimes safety tools fail. That is not a moral failing in and of itself, because techniques and rules in games sometimes just don't work, and that's okay. What matters is how you handle it. The correct way to handle something like this would have been, I don't know, say I was in Natalie's game, not that I think Natalie's game would ever have a failure like that, ever, but say something happened in Natalie's game that left me, I have chronic and complex PTSD, and sometimes I just freeze. It happens. And I didn't use my safety tool, but I'm upset. The way I think Natalie would handle it, because Natalie is a good person and amazing, is Natalie would come over to me after game, or maybe pause game and be like, hey guys, let's go do a snack or bio break, and go, hey Jax, are you okay? Do you want to talk about it? Is there anything I can do for you? What Natalie would not do is go on Twitter and say, the safety mechanics are the problem. It is society who's to blame and not me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, safety mechanics sometimes fail. The correct way to go about dealing with that is communication. Talk to your players. They're not your enemies.
I'm gonna go with Natalie first, Conri, because I also want to circle around to like how you introduce them as well. So go ahead, Nat.
One thing I run into again and again as an avid fan of Monster Hearts is people not realizing how much teenage trauma that they have until they're mid-game for that. Like, they're like, yeah, this is fine. It's going to be fun and light. And then realize they're holding a lot of stuff from their teenage years. So it's just kind of become a tradition after Monster Hearts that I have to do after game check-ins on usually a few of my players and make sure, are you okay? Like, are you doing well?
Yeah.
Are you holding up? Do you want to keep going? It's okay if you want to drop out. I can have your character have been, suddenly had to move out of town. It'll be okay. And I think that just that little like small check-in afterwards usually helps people. But it's a constant challenge with I found in Monster Hearts specifically.
Absolutely. Conri?
So to quickly cover how I introduce things, and then I'll get into a couple of points about the Far Verona situation. So I do a quick spiel ahead of time, but I also, the main thing I do is, and this comes from a writing background of know your audience. If you are going to be doing a con game, and this is from the behind the screen perspective, you're doing a con game, maybe don't go with your heaviest stuff.
Yeah.
Don't
Oh, yeah.
go with the craziest stuff unless it is explicitly pointed out that this is going to be this, and people are kind of buying in the same way they would go to like a full contact haunted house. Those can get intense, but people know what they're buying in for very, very far in advance. So keeping an idea of this is a con game, okay, let me go with some fare that is generally accepted, go for the PG-13R line, to use the MPAA kind of
Yep.
scale, and then maybe push into something a little bit, because people forget, like Exorcist is PG-13.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Actually, Exorcist is PG. Now that I think about it, but that was before the
Yeah, they changed the rating system since then.
Yeah.
changed the rating
Okay.
system. There's some funny. If you look back, there's some horror movies that are technically PG because they don't drop F-bombs all the time.
Yep.
But to circle around to the Far Verona thing, I think the main failing was, I believe in one of the statements it was said that there were no safety tools in place, and that was from the, and if there were safety tools in place and they didn't use them, okay, then that was them missing that point. The main problem that I had was the way agency was removed in
Mhm.
and we're done. And
Yeah,
there
very
was a
much.
specific point, and this is where the failing happened for me. Even not having safety tools in mind, where the players said, "No, wait, I want to call for help. No, wait, I want to say this," and
Mhm.
somebody else adding on and saying, "Yes, do that." And there was this, "Oh, but we're done for the day. Wipe your hands," and over.
Yeah.
And that was the worst crime for me in that, was that not only was there the violation, the screw up in the first place, there was the lack of listening to the players in the moment at the table.
Yep.
Like, as soon as you heard, "No, no, 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 don't, I want to say this, I want to do this," that's not where you go. And that's where we end off with a bang. Mm,
Ugh.
Allow
Yeah.
your player, if your players say, "No, this is unresolved, this needs to be resolved now,"
Mhm.
resolve it in that moment. Listen to the players and let them finish, even if it's a moment of, "Okay, what are we doing next? This is what's happening next." Give closure.
Agreed. And it circles back around to communicating with the players. Yes.
Something I heard in a LARP once, which didn't really resonate with me at the time because it seemed too broad, but as I've been writing safety sections and talking about safety at table professionally, a GM I had said, "Hey, we all abide by this social contract to be kind and respectful of each other while we are playing this game. If one of us thinks you are not respecting that social contract, you may be asked to leave." And I'm like, well, what does that mean exactly? But as I've been engaging with safety, this idea of being kind and respectful, this idea of treating other players' trauma like you would want your trauma to be seen and cared for at the table is so important. And so you really do, even with the safety tools, you really do kind of have to have that general thing of, hey, you might have someone who, God forbid, is abusive at your table and is
Mhm.
using those tools to get around safety, and someone points out that they're doing that. You may just have to ask them to leave, and that sucks. And I'm not going to deny that that sucks, because that goes back to the geek social fallacy thing I talked about earlier. But sometimes you just have to do that.
Absolutely.
Not every game is for every player, and that's another important thing.
So that's a good closing note because we are out of time. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in for this panel. It's a very important one. And I hope that if you aren't using consent rules and safety mechanics, that you start, and that you learn something from this. And if you are, I hope this was helpful in some fashion. So very quickly, if we want to swing around and just say where people can find you online if they have questions or want to follow up with you, Crystal.
You can find me at thegeekypanda.com. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at bodyandsoul152. I am also on Facebook. I have a public Facebook page. And if I do know you and you are not friends with me, you are welcome to send me a friend request. But yes, otherwise, please follow me on Facebook.
Wonderful. Natalie?
I'm on Twitter at Natalie_20, the word spelled out. Also, please follow my company. We're at CharmPersonGame on Twitter or Facebook/CharmPersonGames.
Fantastic. Conri?
I can be found on Twitter at the Conri and on Twitch at twitch.tv/DevilsLuckGaming and our website devilsluckgaming.com.
Jax?
Hi. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram as RuffleJax. You can find my professional website at jacquelinebryk.design. You can also find my LARP company, which unfortunately I started this year, so that's a little bit on hold right now. But you can find that on Facebook as Ruffled Feathers LLC.
Fantastic. I mean, we're an events company.
That's
Cassie?
You can find me on Twitter. I'm at lovelygm_Cassie, and our website is lovelycraftians.com.
Fantastic. As I said, thank you all for joining me for this panel. I learned some things, which is wonderful, and I hope everyone else did. And we will be back shortly with our Rusty Quill interview.
Please stick around for the Rusty Quill interview. It's going to be amazing.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Yeah.